All right, this breakout will be on controller as versus $ scope, or how to read pre-Angular 1.5 code. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just go to the AngularJS documentation. And if we go to their site and we look at, well, actually, I'll show you. If you go to the tutorial, the tutorial is actually done with components. Some of the earlier sections in the tutorial use like the older like controller stuff, but then the rest of the tutorial actually does use components in that style. But if you were to go to the API reference and then look at something like ng model, like this, and then we look at some of the examples. Yeah, this example has a controller, and it has that $scope thing. And then if we look at the view, it's got like the ng controller directive. Yeah, so I guess what we'll do real quick is I'll just write this exact same code as a component so we can see it side by side. And then I'll talk a little bit more about what's actually happening with the component, and that's the controller as version of it. Okay, I have an HTML document. It will bring in Angular. CDN Angular.js version 1.6.1 is the latest stable version. Angular.js. Cool. I've got Angular, and then I'm just going to copy this code. Okay, so it's got this module, and then if I want that to work, I'm going to need to do an ng-app up here that says input example. Let's try it out. Zero? What's supposed to happen? Oh, it turns red when it's not a number. So when I do that, yeah, it turns red. Yeah. So when it's a number, it's not red, and then when it is not a number, it turns red. Okay, well, let's look at the actual code that's doing this. So we've got ourselves a module, and we've got ourselves a controller. The controller then has this funky like array syntax where it says $scope. Then the actual controller function has $scope declared as a dependency. And if we look at, oh, it's using like a bunch of other directives. So there's this ng pattern directive where you can specify if the input doesn't satisfy this regular expression, then show this invalid class. It automatically adds that. But regardless of that, like how does this compare to the one with components? So I'm just going to duplicate this and then modify it, and then we can look at it side by side. So we'll say component. So the first thing that happens is instead of a controller, we create a component. So let's do something like we'll do .component, and we'll say validate, I guess. Yeah, validate input. So that's the name of our component. And then that takes an object that has a few properties. The first one is controller. That's going to be a function. And actually, I'm just going to take this function exactly as it is and set that as the controller. And then lastly, we need a template. And I'm just going to use a template literal and put our template in there. And so in this case, our template is this form, right? Because that's what has the ng controller on it. So I'm going to grab that form, put that as the template, and now I can get rid of that ng controller, and then right here where that controller was, I use my actual component. So I'm going to throw in input validate dash input. I believe I have to specify this camel case. Okay, so got a component. Its name is validate input. It has a controller function that just sets a value, and then has a template that does the thing that it did before. So if I've done everything correctly, it should just work. Just instead, now it's inside of a component. Yeah, it's breaking though. Is it doing the opposite? No, it's just totally broken. 1 doesn't match. Let's see. Yeah, so because this thing is $scope, well, no, that should actually work. But the idea is instead of $scope, you actually don't use that at all when you're using the component style. So if I get rid of $scope, and then I just say create a VM, and then say VM.$on init, and that itself is a function. And then inside of there, instead of scope.val, I do vm.val. And instead of val inside of here, I do $control.val. Alrighty, let's see what happens. Still broken. Could be. Maybe, because it's inside of this template string. Let's do this. I'll just throw it in its own file because I don't know what's going on there. So let's call this. Stop it. Let's call this validate input.html. Throw that in there, and then here instead of template, I can do template URL as validate input.html. Let's see. Yeah, that was it. For whatever reason, like when I put that template in line, I think it was probably doing something with the escaping of the regular expression. But now so instead of putting the template in line, you can just tell it where it is inside of a file. And actually, let me change this back to $scope just to show that it should work. So if I do $scope and then I do $scope.val equals 1. And then over here, instead of control.val, I just do val. Should work. So 1, 2, 3, everything's valid, but then once I do that, it's broken. Okay, let's look at these side by side. So let's split this. And actually, let me just do that. Yeah. Okie doke. So if we look at the actual controller function, one of the main things you're seeing is there is no $scope, right? What happens is it's actually hidden from you. It's been set using this thing called controller as. So the main difference is all of your values wouldn't be put on scope instead. They're going to be put on this. And then inside of your view, all of your values aren't just bare values like they would be in the docs. Instead, all of your values would be bound to $control. Yeah, I also want to show, so like this syntax is also syntax that you might see elsewhere. So this array is actually just extra. You don't need it. It's for if you're doing things like minification, but these two controllers, one that specifies the array with a string and then one that specifies without it, these two controllers are exactly the same. So in the docs, when you see this array, it's really just extra stuff that doesn't necessarily need to be there for what we're dealing with. And this is ultimately what you're getting. Question so far? Yeah.
When would you need the array?
When you're doing minification. So the idea is because of dependency injection, so you're saying you're declaring a dependency on $scope. But if you were to minify your code, this variable name would change. It'd become like the little letter A or something like that. So by specifying this array, it lets...
Is that like linking them together or something?
Right, so if this were to change, like you could call this A if you wanted, and then when Angular runs, it's like, oh, you're saying A, but I know you mean $scope, and then it would inject $scope instead. But since we're not minifying our code right now, we don't actually have to worry about that. Okay, so yeah, and then this controller function, we just specify the things directly on $scope. However, if I wanted to do this like the VM style, so I feel like I'm getting kind of all over the place right now, but questions so far on like what I'm doing and kind of like what the difference is here.
So the view model that you're declaring when you say this, is that the same thing as scope behind the scenes, or is it?
It's a property on scope.
Okay.
And actually, I'll show that with this. So instead of doing this here, I'll use it just like a controller using the exact same style. So here I'll just say, well, const VM equals this, and then this vm.val equals 1. And then what happens is on the controller, I can say example controller as $control. And by doing that, now everything I want to reference, I have to put behind $control. So remove the scope. Don't put anything on scope. Just put it on this instead. Put it on the view model. And then when you specify the controller, you say controller as, and you call it $control. So that's actually what's happening with the component. It's saying controller as and as $control, so that way it could be used. So if we look at this, now I'm using the controller as syntax. It's going to behave exactly the same way, but we've hidden $scope in that controller. So VM, putting things on VM and then specifying your controller as is what the component is actually doing. So it's saying like inside of the view, everything will be referenced off the controller with that variable. And by default, that's what you get in a component. But you could call this anything. Like you could call this just example. And then here, this would be example. It still works. We just have given it a different name inside of the view. And then in terms of the component, you can actually override the default $control as well. So if you said controller as in here and then said just example, now inside of your view, instead of $control, you would say example. And that should still work. 3, like that. So basically, by default, a component's controller as is $control. Cool. don't clap. You're obviously confused. Don't clap. Cool. Yeah.
So like, if you do an on init and then you do like view model dot val equals, so do you have to make like? I'm just confused how that works with other functions. So if you were to create something, do you need to make another function if you're gonna, like? I just don't really understand.
If you want custom behavior, so like if you wanted like to do something, so VM, I would say like vm.do something, and I would actually create that as a function if I needed it. So like on click, run this function. That's totally valid.
But then how do you specify that? So if you're saying like, okay, I want this function to like on click do the thing, get the values from a form.
Yeah.
How would you then? I'm confused about how to like use the form. Like, how do you write the syntax of that? So do you have to say like, you know, $?
To call this function?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's actually really easy. Let me also. So yeah, in my controller, I've now got do something, and let's just say this creates an object that has a property called val that is vm.val. And then it logs the object. So like, let's say like you were getting that from a form or something like that. And then I'll just alert hello, and then tell it what the value of the val is. So because I've put a function called do something on the VM, now inside of the view, I could create like a button. And on the button, I say ng-click equals. Actually, I'm going to go back and get rid of my controller as, just so it's the default. So the controller is $control. So for the ng-click, it's going to be $control. Everything in the controller is always going to be behind $control. And then you want the name of the function, do something, and then you actually invoke it. You're not technically invoking it right now. What you're saying is when this button is clicked, evaluate this expression. And by evaluating that expression, that function gets invoked. And so then when that function runs, it can grab the value from the VM, like that's the thing on the input. It can log it. You could send it off to a server. You can really do anything you want there. But on index component, what happened? Module input example is not available. Okay. Oh, line 21. Oh, that. Okay. So, oh, I didn't put anything in the button. So now when I click the button, it's going to run that function inside the controller. It'll create the object, log it to the console, and then alert the value. So I created that object, logged it out, and then just sent the alert. But the idea is inside of this function, if you, let's say like you want to grab the values from the form, I would manually create an object. So like we'll say like name is vm.firstname, and then age is vm.age. And these values would just be anything that was like an ng model on the form. So I have an input ng model first name, input ng model age. Now inside of this function, by creating your object like that, you're just grabbing those values off the view model, and then you can specify them. So like let's say I were to create another input, type is text, name is age, and the ng model is $control.age. And then I did another one for name, and the model is control.name. And so now when I click the button, I'm actually going to be grabbing values from all three of these inputs. So refresh this, say 1, we'll say 45, and we'll say Jim. Say hello. Now I've created this object. It has name. Oh, I think I did vm.firstname.
Is that how we would do those simple interactions?
Very, very similar to this, yes. So like in the click, you access all the values.
So create an object first.
Well, potentially, like I don't remember exactly what that one's asking you for, but this is the common pattern that you follow, like when you're submitting a form and you're like trying to get values off of the page. Create your object, and then at this point, like I could make a post request with it or something like that. So like 43, Jim, and then now I have this object. I could do whatever I want with it.
When you do forms, does it need to have like type equals text in order for it to be able to grab the value?
ng model is the only, really the only thing it needs. Typically, you want to put type equals text on there.
Okay.
But like this, like ng model is what links this input to our controller. So this is what says like when this input changes, it's going to be modifying that specific property on the view model.
Okay. I'm just trying to debug a form currently. So
Sure.
data showing up. I was like, oh, I don't have type text.
Yeah, I mean, like make sure the name is the same here that maybe you're trying to access in the controller. Darren?
Oh, it's just the name represents nothing then though.
Oh yeah, so this is purely for the form itself. Like if I had a label well, actually labels don't need names, do they? They need IDs. So yeah, this is purely for if I were going to let the form submit itself to the server, like then it would use those names. But typically in Angular, you're always submitting like with an AJAX request. Like on submit, do some manual stuff to get the stuff out of the form, and then submit it to some server. Does that help, Hannah?
Yeah.
Does this make sense? Any questions about this?
I think like in the curriculum,
Mhm.
maybe it's Apple or something, because they said to do that exercise, but then they don't really talk about data binding or anything until like later on in the other readings. So I guess I was just confused about exactly what they wanted us to do in certain parts of it.
So in the simple interaction one,
Yeah.
like the few paragraphs right before that exercise is where it talks about data binding. So it's got your ng model and then the expression, but that's pretty much the only place you'll see it. But that's basically as complex as it gets. Like you have your ng model here, and then maybe an expression in your view, and then inside of your controller, you just access it off of VM.
I was just confused about how to get the function to work with, like how you actually, like what the syntax is to like call that inside of the form. That
Yeah,
would-
and that just looks like that.
Yeah, I did that and it just didn't work, so I'm just confused about.
But if you can go back to the controller, so I was having the same problem, like how do I grab the input and build it into some function? So you're saying we have to create that object first and then call it by VM.name or VM.
I mean, you don't have to create that object. I'm just using that as an example. The idea is
How would you grab the input form in your function?
it's on VM. So
Just VM.
yeah, because I put ng model, so VM.age or VM.firstname,
Oh.
and then I can access it. So
Okay.
if I just log, don't do that. Yeah, like
Oh, okay.
and
And model sets it.
yeah, and like that's the idea with data binding. I just set the model there, and then now anywhere in any function inside my controller, I have access to the current value.
So if you set ng model, you can call it anything you want in the form model, and then so
Yeah.
you can make it up whatever you
Yeah,
want.
but
then-
you definitely want to put it on $control. So $control dot whatever you want,
Right, okay.
and then inside of your controller, you say VM dot whatever you want, and you have that value.
Okay.
How
Cool.
do you know when you need to use like, dot notation, like if it's on an object?
It's because we're using components. Every single thing you do is going to be off of $control. Like
Well, like in one of the docs, it would have like $control, and so like say I had a shopping cart and then an item, it'd be like $control dot cart dot item.
Mm.
Is that if you're just trying to print specific parts of it? Does that make sense?
it just means that
Maybe
VM.cart is a thing. That's all that means. It means that the $control.cart, so that means there's a property on VM called cart, and then .item means that it would have a property called item. Like if that's what it says in the view, then there would have to be something that looks like this in the controller. But
Doesn't it create an object if you haven't specifically created one already?
yeah, I mean, it wouldn't create an object. It might create like a blank property. If you're binding to an input, it's going to be a string. But yeah, so you could do this. You could say control.data.age.
And it'll make the data object.
Yeah, it'll make an object, and then control.data.name, name. And now inside of here, if I log vm.data, it will actually create an object with two properties on it. It will create an object, give it an age, and give it a name property. So now if I refresh this,
So is that what you do if you're not manually creating an object in the function?
and you'll notice I just logged data, and it automatically created that object for me. Yeah, so I think that might be where a little of the confusion might be coming from as well, is like in, quick break. In your view, if you see something off of control and then a period after that, that means this has to be an object. So Angular actually creates that object for you, right? Because this is still just JavaScript. JavaScript, if you want properties, it has to be an object, so that creates an object.
Can you use bracket notation for that?
Yeah, totally. You could say, well, I don't know if you could create an array, but you could have like vm.numbers equals an array 0, 1, 2. And then if you want to access it over here, you could say vm.numbers at 0, and that would actually bind it to the 0th index. That's actually really weird. Let's do this. vm.numbers.
So would that just replace?
I believe so. I'm going to see what happens. So if I log the array, yeah, now the first value in the array is that.
That's a string.
Yeah, and then if I log it again, now it's that. Because I'm actually, yeah, it's literally just JavaScript, and it behaves in the exact same way. But now this is binding to the 0th index inside of that array. Probably would never do that, though. Yeah.
So, there, what if like in your function you needed to pass something in?
Yeah, that works too.
then-
So, yeah, like on here,
Yeah.
is just valid JavaScript. So let's say I want to do something, but I specifically want to pass in the name. So I could just do that. And then now my function would accept a name, and then there I could just log the name.
So you just set it equal, or like set it on control though?
Well, yeah, so like it's going to be some value like on the model that you want to be passing in. It's probably going to be like in an ng repeat or something like that, so you may not have to put $control on it.
Because I mean, if you did $control, couldn't you access it anyway?
Exactly, yeah. So like if you're going to be accessing something off the view model, you probably don't want to be passing it in. But for like the Reddit clone, you'll have functions that are on specific posts, right? You have like multiple posts. Each post has like an add comment button. So when you're adding a comment, you're not adding it to like a global comments array. You're adding it to a comments array for that specific post. So it would make sense to like pass in the post and then like access its comments array off of that. But yeah, so it's really still just JavaScript. So like you could even put actual values in here, like 99. And then we'll just see 99. But yeah, this could be anything. I guess also like, I guess this is weird. You probably would never do this, but if you have something that's not on control, so like let's say I set this ng model as wat. Now right here, if I say wat, I'm actually referencing the value of this, even though it's not on control. But inside of the controller, I wouldn't have access to it because I haven't put $control in front of it, right? And so if I log, yeah, let's log wat right there. But then if I try to log vm.wat, it's not a thing. I believe this is the wat one. Right, so this is wat, and this is vm.wat, which is not defined because I didn't put it on $control. The things.
What's the data, like control.data? What is that?
Where are we at? Oh yeah, so I was just saying, if you ever see this even in the docs, this will actually create an object on the view model. So this creates an object that has two properties, age and name. And a lot of times when you're creating a form, it makes sense to do this because then you don't have to manually create that object in your controller. Because right here, if I just log vm.data, it's going to have all of the properties of the form. So, and then if I do like control.data.wat, and then control.data.something else, and then control.data.whatever. Now when I log vm.data, it's going to be an object that has all of those properties. So if I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and log it, now it's an object that has all of those properties with the values that were specified in the inputs. Cool. I think I'm going to stop talking now. Any other questions? Yeah. Let me just maybe pull like one more example from the Angular docs and like what's actually happening there. Let's take, for example, what's a directive that is a little confusing or that you've had to look at the docs for?
Pluralize.
Pluralize, sure. ng pluralize. Yeah, this one's really interesting. If we look at the usage, yeah. And then I need my Angular. And this is an app called Pluralize Example. Yeah, that should work. Cool. Oh god. I don't even know what this is trying to do. So person 1 is CJ, person 2 is Andy. number of people 2. But if I do number of people 1, one person is viewing, CJ is viewing. But if I do 2, CJ and Andy are viewing. So it replaces is with are. That's the blue polarization. But if we were to just look at that controller, let's try to convert this together to a component. Okay, what would be the first thing I need to do to make this a component?
Before controller put dot component.
Yeah, I'm just going to do it right here, but yeah. Component.
Name it.
Yeah, let's give it a name. Let's call it pluralize example. Then what do I need? It's an object. Yeah. So and it has a couple of properties. One of them is controller. And for now, we can just take that function, set it as the controller. And then the other thing it needs is template. I don't know if there's anything special about this one. I'm just going to try to use that syntax. And then I'll take that whole thing, throw it in a template, get rid of ng controller, and now we can use my, oh dang, I named the component the same thing as the module. Let's see what happens.
You know why they do that? The like camel case and dash.
I think it's, I don't have a good reason off the top of my head. I know it's it has to do with like how it decides to parse elements that it comes across. Because when Angular sees that, it has to figure out that it needs to replace it like with a component.
Yeah.
It might have something to do with like the syntax for like CSS selectors too. Because I don't know if you can have, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. But let's take a look at this. Now if I refresh it, still works. But if I change it to 2, we get that nice little fraction. But now we're directly accessing scope. We want to use the view model instead. So instead of doing that, I'll remove scope. I'll make this all VM. And then inside of here, everywhere I see an ng model, it needs to be ng model with $control dot that specific property. And then if we refresh it,
Declare this.
yes, you are correct. Yeah. So and then I would do const VM equals this. And I mean, you know JavaScript, but this is the exact same thing as doing this, right? But it's just it's customary to give it the VM name, right? And that's really just style. But if I do that, it's broken. Oh, I have to update these as well. So the count is $control.personCount. And the count is $control.personCount. 2. And then down here in all of my bindings, these need to be $control.person1, and this needs to be $control.person2. Like in doing it this style, it may seem like more work because your views are a little bit, like everything you have to actually put control in front of, but by doing this, instead of doing it the scope way, you actually prevent yourself from running into a whole set of problems that just don't come up if you put everything on $control anyways. So if I do this, I think we're ready to go. Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of the basic conversion. If you see $scope, it really just means they're using controller as under the hood. Oh, you would be using controller as. Yeah. And I didn't talk about pluralize but that's that. Other things. Cool. Keep on keeping on.